So thank you for joining us for Where Have All the Soils Gone? Erosion in Southern Maryland. Dr. Jim Gibb will be our speaker tonight. My name is Allison and I work for St. Mary's County Library, and I'll be facilitating the presentation tonight. And as always, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can also type your question in the chat if you'd prefer to do that instead. All right, are we ready to get started?
I'm ready. Well, good evening, everybody. This is kind of an initial attempt at bringing together several archaeology projects over the years into some kind of meaningful narrative, a story that I think is very important to our understanding of how we interact with the environment. And in terms of looking at our surroundings today and recognizing that what we see today is not the environment, is not the surroundings of 200, 300, 400 years ago, or for that matter, 40 years ago. We've altered our environment considerably, and I don't mean just in terms of building roads and houses and businesses, but the lay of the land, the distribution of soils, the quality of the soils, the vegetation. What we see today would have been alien to folks less than a century ago. And I want to start off with a quote. I've used it before, and it's attributed to Patrick Henry, the Virginia statesman from the 18th century. No one's been able to actually narrow it down, where did he actually say this? But Patrick Henry is alleged to have said, "He is the most patriotic who stops up the most gullies." That is, those are the most patriotic people who repair the damage to soils caused by stormwater, mostly. Recognizing that those soils were important for our survival as a nation and for our economy today. So we've got these different lines of evidence, and this is something I'm working on with Ray Sarnacki, who's on this call. And it's looking at different sources, different evidence of damage to our soils specifically. And I'm going to be talking about soil exhaustion, but I want to start off being very clear as to what I mean by that. Around the mid-19th century, people started talking about soil exhaustion, and I think they meant something different from what we mean or think today. You think soil exhaustion, that means loss of fertility, loss of the nutrients in the soil that make them productive. But the way I use it, and I think the way it was used prior to the mid-19th century, or even in the mid-19th century, is that soil exhaustion is the loss of not only nutrients, but of the soil itself. And it's really key to keep that in mind as we go through this evening. So I'm going to look at sort of household and farm scale, then look at the landlocking of poor towns. And those of you who have attended these before or have some idea what I'm talking about there. Manuring with urban garbage as a way of getting rid of large quantities of garbage in Baltimore and Washington in the early 20th century and turning it into something that was vitally needed in rural areas, which is to say fertilizer. And then finally, the creation of the Maryland Bureau of Immigration, a state agency designed, surprisingly enough, given our historical context today, to go out and find immigrants and bring them here to Maryland to occupy exhausted farms. So let's start off with house lots. And some of this, for those of you who have attended these things, will be familiar because I've talked about it before in different contexts. This is a picture taken in front of the Selman House, or the Woodlawn as we now call it, at Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And that's Leo Plourde, who's cleaning up the top of what appears to be the hearth, the large open hearth of a kitchen, a summer kitchen that served the house sometime in the late 18th and early 19th century. The interesting thing about this picture is that the bricks for the base of that hearth are barely 6 inches below the sod line. Now, clearly it was not built that way, so soil has been lost. Here's a view of it once exposed. And you can see as you move towards the road, it's not even 6 inches. It's just that you pull up the sod and there's the foundation and there's the hearth. That means we've lost a lot of soil from that surface. Again, some of these images should be familiar. You can see a series of excavation units. They're numbered. And we've done this analysis, or Sarah Grady, one of our number, did this analysis some years ago, just like looking at the sherd size from one cluster of units with another cluster, with those from a unit all the way down the hill. And she found that as you go downhill, the sherd size gets smaller. And I have a graphic for that. Let me get my toolbar out of the way here. So the thing to look at the bottom is that the average weight of these sherds was 2.59 with the upper units, 1.94, so just under 2 grams average sherd weight for the middle cluster, and all the way down the hill, 0.5 gram. And all that suggests is that the sherd size gets smaller as you go downhill, which is exactly what you would see in terms of gravel and soil particle size, is that as the water goes down the hill and eventually its force is dissipated, its energy is dissipated, smaller and smaller particles precipitate out of it. So it's just a classic of what you would expect to see if we were looking at soils. So we have a model here, oops, sorry about that, that shows, I wish we could get these damn toolbars off the screen here. They're a pain in the butt. So we've got movement of soils going down the hill. And unit 411, as again, many of you have seen this, we have an excavation unit 1 meter on a side going down over 1 meter in depth. And you could see stratum 1 is modern topsoil, but stratum after stratum of redeposited soils. The little black things are bits of charcoal. We find very small sherds of glass and ceramic that are identical to those we found up in front of the house around the summer kitchen. So what this represents is some unknown period of time of soil loss uphill, redeposition downhill, eventually covering the dark soil at the bottom, stratum 9, which is a plowed soil. So it was cultivated. So even that is historic period. We're not looking at the deep dark past. This is within the last 200-300 years, perhaps. We can't date it because the only artifacts that came out of it were the remains of a late woodland Native American pot. But we know it's a plow site. It's definitely been plowed, so it's much later than the late woodland, which ends around 1600. Some of that soil very likely came from the eroded driveway that was created by automobiles going up and back and forth to the house, keeping in mind that we don't really have automobiles around here prior to World War I. So this is a relatively recent feature. At some point, somebody poured concrete, as you can see in the photograph, and that greatly slowed erosion. Since the rehabilitation of the Woodlawn house, all this has been redone, so you can't see this anymore. But it's hard to tell from the picture here, but the top of the surface to the right is a good almost 5 feet above the concrete. That's how much soil has been lost. And so we have 2 models for what has happened here. We have erosion from the driveway in the 20th century. We have erosion from the top of the summer kitchen, certainly by the 20th century. How much earlier, we don't know yet. But this is just from the use of the house lot. This is not agriculture. Down below, I don't know if you could see my cursor, but this is unit 11 over here towards the right of your screen. We dug a number of shovel test pits and recorded the soils. That's me climbing into one of them. And we've got this profile here. The red lens here, the red stratum, that's the original topsoil. Everything above it is redeposited. So this is all stuff that's washed from downhill. So you can see the model here. Washes down the driveway and from the summer kitchen down past Unit 11 to create this. And then those sediments continue going downhill into the creek. So what used to be in front of the Selman house has now partially filled the creek below. I thought last minute I'd throw in this little bit of some work that we are engaged in right now, west of Waldorf in Charles County, where we have a site we identified a number of years ago. And there's a barn in the middle of this overgrown field. And you can see the topography. This is the high spot towards the center of the image. This is the high spot. And the slopes go downhill to what appears to have been a relic stream channel that may have filled with sediment centuries, if not millennia ago. And this is the profile of the one unit we've excavated so far. The top stratum 1 here is a plowed soil, but notice all the gravel in it. Below that is a truncated plow zone, also filled with gravel. Below that, number 3 is a dense, dark-colored, buried topsoil horizon. And below that is kind of a subsoil. In the two top strata, we find a lot of Native American artifacts dating back at least for the past 2,000 years, along with historic material. And that's true of strata 1 and stratum 2. The point here is that soils developed from below. We have these very, very gravelly soils, 1 and 2. They could not possibly have developed out of strata 3 and 4, which have some gravel, but relatively little. So the 1 and 2 are soils deposited from uphill. So if our excavation units are down here where the site number is, 18CH884, this high ground here is the source of these soils that washed down, original topsoil and probably gravelly subsoil washed down and continued to be plowed into throughout the historic period. In stratum 3, we have a side-notched projectile point, which is archaic period. So soil, that horizon could be roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years old. And it's full of firecracked rock and flake stone, some really interesting stuff. But it's been buried by essentially soil that's moved through cultivation. The top of stratum 3, that dark colored stuff, you see there are plow scars in it from plowing of the upper material. But when we remove stratum 3 down to stratum 4, which is light colored, no plow scars. So that leads me to think stratum 3 has never been plowed and it's probably just a buried topsoil horizon, buried sometime during the historic period, but dating back thousands of years. All right, look a little bit at local farming and these town sites. Again, I talked about towns very recently. 3 of them, particularly Port Tobacco in Charles County, London Town in Anne Arundel, and Joppa in Harford County. This map comes from the geographer Gottschalk, published in 1945. He looked at a whole bunch of these colonial period town sites in the Chesapeake area and was, just visiting them, mapping them, doing some historical research. All of them, virtually all of them, have been landlocked, including 2 of the 3 here. London Town is not landlocked, but I'll show you that in a moment and you determine whether it's truly open water or not. Port Tobacco, we've got this U.S. Geological Survey map, and I drew a line across this red dashed line, and from that line generated this section, little view showing topography. London Town being down here, this has been exaggerated by a factor of about 10. If you look at the X versus Y scales, but you can see that there are uplands, and you can see them on the map here. There are uplands on either side of the Port Tobacco Creek. And those uplands were intensively cultivated at least since the early 18th century, possibly back into the 17th century. I've taken this model from Gottschalk's paper, redrafted it and given it some clarity, but this is sort of a three-dimensional cutaway view of the surroundings of Port Tobacco Creek. And you can see these uplands and all these ravines leading down to the creek. He says in 1800, the creek was navigable. Here's Port Tobacco here, navigable above and beyond Port Tobacco. By 1862, Port Tobacco hasn't moved, but all that creek is no longer navigable. This is a very good, and I've drawn a squiggly little red lines to show you where that sediment's coming from. He's accurate in his description of what happened. He's inaccurate in terms of the dates. The filling in of Port Tobacco Creek clearly was happening before the American Revolution, and the 1862 map on which this is based shows a situation that had been in place for decades. But it's this process of cultivating the land, over-cultivating it, not using wise farming practices that led to erosion and redeposition of those sediments. And here you can see this is Port Tobacco. I didn't draw a line around it, but around Commerce Street here, that's the town of Port Tobacco. These uplands to the right, you can see the topography here. It's quite steep. And look at these deeply cut, sorry about that, these deeply cut ravines. So soil is eroding from up here and running down the hill, eroding these gullies and depositing the material down here on the floodplain. If you look at this other view of it where I've colorized it, what you've got here are basically these fan deposits that have been created, and each contour line represents 2 feet. So if you count quick, you'll see there's at least about 20 feet high, these deposits along the base of the uplands. In some places you could see, if you walk on a plowed field, you see this kind of big hump of soil in front of you, and as much as 20 feet high. That's all soil that's been redeposited from uphill. Not only that, but a lot of that sediment continued to flow down across the surface and into the creek. So the creek, where you see all these little green things representing marsh, filled with sediment, and across the Port Tobacco, in many places we have 6 inches to 12 inches of redeposited gravelly soil from the uplands sitting on top of very nice deposits that virtually lack gravel. This looks like a lovely little stream, clear running water, gravelly and everything. Well, prior to these 2 tropical storms some years ago, this was a nicely maintained lawn. It was a bit soggy and heavy rains and everything. But what happened is during these tropical storms, either a new gully was cut or an existing one was expanded, and all these gravels were from back behind the house going up that steep hill, I don't know, probably 60 feet, essentially creating a stream bed in front of the Compton's house. This has since been restored. I think it's all grass now, but I think this is pretty amazing. And so when we worked across Port Tobacco, digging these shovel test pits across what looks like nice lawn, looks like your classic floodplain deposits, we dig these shovel test pits, and you can see the darkest soil towards the bottom of the shovel test pit. I don't have a scale here, but this is at least a foot of material here. The darkest stuff is a recently developed topsoil. But all this material in here is gravelly sediment that washed in from uphill, blanketing the site, preserving beautifully 18th century deposits. And just to give you an idea of what came out of that hole, a 1/4-inch mesh screen, mostly gravel, nasty stuff to have to dig through. We've dug a couple of the excavation units. We've dug around Port Tobacco. In this case, you see 6 strata. lots of gravel up towards the top, but lens after lens, and we've dated them using something called mean ceramic dating. Using the ceramics we've recovered from the site, we approximate the mid-date at which these deposits formed. So 1744 in stratum 5, 1751, 1797, 1815, 1817. I mean, so these deposits, they don't have, they lack recent historic material. So these deposits formed over the course of what, 50, 60 years. Another unit nearby. And this one's interesting. Again, we have these dates, mean ceramic dates that we've calculated from 1716, let's say, up through at least 1824. But look at stratum 4. Stratum 4 is actually a gully. So not only were these gravelly deposits or sediments deposited across the site, but subsequent storms cut gullies through it and redeposited new material. So stratum 4 is really a gully that was formed, probably sometime prior to the American Revolution. And SDP is our shovel test pit. And finally not finally, the second town, London Town, which is in Anne Arundel County. The only 18th century house that survives is the William Brown House, used as an ordinary or inn, 1750s, I think. By 1820, it became sort of the center of the county almshouse. It was the poor farm for indigent Anne Arundelians. This is the town site. Basically, the steeper topography marks the town, and this is the South River out here. Look at the bathymetry here. Look at essentially the contour lines, -1, -2, -3, 0. These are shallow waters. This was one time a port, a major port on the South River. And now, actually, if you go into the water now, wade out, you'll see this is really shallow water. There's no way vessels could get in. In fact, I suspect that this little part over here, you see the steep topography, it's almost a rectangle in the lower center portion of the peninsula. I suspect this was a shipyard, ways for ships. We know they were building ships at ports at London Town. So this is a product of redeposited sediments, mostly from agriculture. And finally, as far as the towns go, Joppa, again, I've talked about this recently. This is a 1720s plat of the town. You can see the church lot over here and a bunch of lots that have all, I think, mostly been patented by various individuals, a number of them patenting several lots. It was a vital town up to just before the American Revolution. By the 1820s, it was gone. And you can see why in this aerial photograph. This is also from Gottschalk. But this is Joppa town over here. And what's happened is the shoreline is effectively moved from west to east. This was all navigable creek here. And by 1897, all this was filled in. In fact, by 1846, this was no longer navigable, which is one of the reasons it was no longer a port town. And eventually, and it lost its status as the county seat for Harford County. In fact, Baltimore became a separate county, 250 years ago, and having a deep water port was probably part of that at Baltimore City. Unfortunately, this is Joppa town today, or 1960s. A large part of that area was turned into a residential subdivision. So it's an aerial photograph taken, I think, sometime in the 1960s. And the yellow rectangle marks pretty much what was the limits of Joppa town. And you can see the whole place has just been bulldozed. So our opportunities for recovering interesting data on that town site have been materially degraded by that construction. But if that isn't land modification, I don't know what is. An interesting subject that came across a couple of years ago while looking at just a farmstead in Charles County. And the farmstead was named the EPP farmstead, a German family that had come to the United States and eventually moved out west to Kansas and I think maybe Arkansas. And that led me down this particular line of historical research. Again, in 1896, there was the state formed a Bureau of Immigration. And their job was to go mostly to Eastern Europe and try to recruit farmers. And the deal was, all these great farms in Southern Maryland that had been abandoned. And folks had moved west to Kentucky and points further west. And there were great markets, railroads, steamboats, everything a farmer could want, except for the land was exhausted. Needed fertilizer, which is a pretty big problem. And they managed to recruit people in Eastern Europe, but some of them actually started moving to the American West, to places like Kansas, and recruiting folks, many of whom had emigrated from Europe, and they were enticing them back east. And one of the institutions that grew up out of this was the German American Land Bank. Didn't last very long, but they bought up some of these old farms and tried to flip them as quickly as they could to immigrants, and particularly Germans. And they operated out of this small office in Brandywine, Prince George's County. I'm pretty sure the building is still there. And they were in business for 1912, but World War I came around and we entered the war in 1917. So selling land to German immigrants was no longer an ideal. But it became the Bank of Brandywine and continued as a bank for a number of years. But what they were doing as a bank was essentially buying land and selling it to immigrants, or providing mortgages to immigrants to buy these lands. Well, the farm that initiated all this, and a simplified drawing of it, number 4 is the house site. 1 through 3 are some various farm outbuildings. Number 5 is a barn. So here's the house. And we actually have a picture of the Epp family's house, and I think it's in Kansas, and it looks just like this. Well, I mean, it was in better shape, obviously. Obviously, it's pretty gone now. But this is the house. And this is the barn, which is in much better shape, actually. And it looks like, your classical, gambrel roof, 20th century hay barn. But if you go inside the barn, you see it was a tobacco barn. And more importantly, it was a tobacco barn that was converted for use for hay. So this barn represents the transition this family made from tobacco farming to hay. And part of that is probably, the owners were getting older, their kids went off, and, labor became scarce, and, hay is a lot easier to harvest than tobacco. But we also noticed in doing, here's some of the interior of it. Couldn't get good pictures of it, not good with light. But the problem was the land, and we were dug shovel test pits all over this thing, and the soil was really thin and hard, and there was nary an insect to be seen in those soils. This land was exhausted, not eroded, but greatly diminished in its fertility. And that was a problem across Southern Maryland. Which brings up the subject of fertility, which again is something I've talked about before. particularly manuring. Um, I spoke about the railroads a month or two ago. Well, one of the purposes for the Drum Point Railroad, which was never actually finished, was to bring manure, Peruvian guano or bird manure, by boat up to Drum Point, the southern end of Calvert County, load it on trains and ship it up through the rest of southern Maryland, where it would be sold as fertilizer. Fertilizer was really in demand. I think they were bringing it in up to northern Anne Arundel County too, near Pasadena. Well, so several situations occurred at the same, more or less in succession. The later being World War II. And it was common for folks to collect in individual trash cans, apart from metals and glass and that sort of thing, and coal ash. Those would be bucketed up separately. But to take their food waste, their kitchen waste, put it in a special bucket. And the idea is it would be shipped out of town to piggeries and fed to pigs. But there are several things several ways of dealing with garbage. One of them was, and this was occurring in the late 19th century certainly, was to take garbage in urban sites like Washington and Baltimore, and there's a hefty record on this. You look at proceedings of the city councils, even in the case of Washington, D.C., congressional action, engineering magazines, they talk about this whole process of we have these rapidly expanding cities, we have a lot of garbage we need to get rid of. At the same time, we have these rural areas that are sorely in need of fertilizer to improve the productivity of their farmlands. So in the late 19th century and into early 20th century, we have garbage trucked out or on wagons out to farmlands and just dumped on the fields. Probably not a great idea. I mean, it increases fertility, but it has its own side effects as well. The other approach, and we have an example of this in northern Anne Arundel County, is they would bring it to a field where they excavated these large pits and dump the garbage into the pits and essentially composted it. And these are called poudrette pits. And they include garbage, but also human wastes. And then incineration, which starts in the early 20th century, where they've got incinerators in the cities and they're fueling them with all kinds, not just kitchen refuse, but all kinds of trash to burn, to create steam that in some cases produced electricity, but other uses for steam power. And then there were also these rendering plants, and there was one in northern Anne Arundel County for Baltimore, where these garbage, unsorted garbage, trash, all kinds of stuff would go through this process where they would recycle metals. They would incinerate this stuff to create steam, which if nothing else ran the plant. Some stuff would just go off to a landfill, but they would produce grease, or what they call pitch, which they refined into glycerin, which became a basic component of soap, explosives, and cosmetics. There's an unholy alliance if I ever heard one. In World War I, nitroglycerin was an important part of the ammunition, the weaponry used. And so during World War I, these rendering plants were really important as a source of glycerin. And of course, to make soap for the doughboys, cosmetics, I don't know. They also produced something called tankage, which is a sort of dehydrated organic residual from the process that would be used to make fertilizer. And again, this is an important product for the local farmers dealing with exhausted soils. And a certain amount of ash. You've all heard, I'm sure, of cinder blocks. And you know a cinder block when you see one, or at least you think you do. Most cinder blocks we see today are concrete blocks. They're not cinder blocks. Cinder blocks actually have cinders in them. So early 20th century blocks, if you look at them carefully, will have these little black dots throughout. Those are cinders from incineration. So it was used as a fill material in making those blocks. And of course, it produces a certain amount of water, which is simply discarded. This is the interior of one of those plants where they're processing this stuff. So they're kind of a big deal, but they don't last very long. 10 years, they start wearing out and have to be rebuilt or a new one built altogether. The other process, of course, is feeding the garbage, just the garbage, not the ash, not the other trash, but just the garbage, to pigs at pig farms. And the calculations I've seen is they expected to get a pound of live weight pork out of every 50 pounds of garbage. Plus, you get the manure from the pigs, which can be composted and then spread on fields or just spread on fields during the winter. And then there's also other stuff that comes through. There's bone, of course, from all these, restaurants and households across, say, Baltimore. Bone was collected and used. It was an important material. Previously, it had been used for making buttons, but it was broken down and used in a variety of chemical processes to make various products. Some recyclable metal, also very important for the war effort, World War I. And then, of course, rubbish that just goes off to the landfill. So here's a couple of pictures of the piggery in northern Anne Arundel County to which Baltimore material went between 1919 and 1921. They had little railroads there, barges would come up to a pier and they'd have like a steam shovel that would lift this stuff up and put it on these railroad carts that would just, as you could see in the right-hand image, you could see the rail line, the light gauge rail line that goes down there, pig enclosures on either side. It ended up failing after just a couple of years. And I thought this photograph was interesting out of the Engineering News Record. Patriotic hogs help in wartime by eating camp garbage. And you could see in the middle of the field, they got I guess it's the pigs kind of all crowded up to create US out on the field. Just a publicity thing. But again, the important thing was, there are three things going on here. There's getting rid of an increasingly problematic issue with it, which is garbage in a rapidly growing city, cities that could not keep pace with their growing populations. Producing useful resources from that garbage, which is particularly important during World War I, and then again during World War II. And then finally, but not least, producing fertilizer for these exhausted soils in southern Maryland. So here, you can see this map of Maryland. You've got these two core areas. And I haven't actually calculated or been trying to calculate just how far one might expect this garbage to go from these downtown areas. I tried with a circle, 10-mile radius circle around each town. Well, these arrows point to sites where I've identified garbage, and I'll show you in a moment how I managed to do that, but identified garbage that was part of this recycling process beyond that 10-mile limit. Now, for Baltimore, it was simple to explain because the material would come down the Patapsco River to northern Anne Arundel County, so water transportation. But Washington, I've got areas in Clinton and further south, and even down in Bennsville in central Charles County, a long way from Washington, D.C., and we have this process going on. How do we see it archaeologically? Well, in the case of the Russell Farm in Prince George's County, near Brandywine, I can call it Brandywine, really, digging a bunch of holes, shovel test pits, and coming up with stuff like this. This is not the kind of material you'd find on your average farm site. These are all institutional wares. They're heavy ceramics that could take a beating in an institutional kitchen with decorations you just don't see on your average farmstead. And one of them, the dark brown one down here, is almost certainly from the Statler Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. And we have this group here from the Brentwood subdivision, Bennsville, again, a long way from D.C. And there's one part of the farm, it had been bulldozed by the time I got there, but you could see these institutional wares all over the place. This is not from your local farmstead. And one or two of them actually have the initials ANC, which I'm pretty sure I haven't been able to nail this down, town Washington. Restaurants and hotel restaurants and other institutional sources like Fort Meade, for instance, were great places to get large quantities of high quality garbage to feed to pigs. Stuff from the cities is a little more problematic because people would never sort things the way they're supposed to, and they'd find razor blades mixed in with the garbage and all kinds of nasty stuff that sometimes escaped notice and wound up in the pigs, killing them. So characteristics of these pig manured fields, when we find them, it's really just food related. It's kitchen stuff, stuff that made it, accompanied the garbage, but was sorted out on site, or the pigs simply ate around it. And we find this stuff with the manure was probably mixed with the manure and then just spread across the fields. So we find fields covered with non-architectural kitchen related artifacts. No clustering, fairly uniformly distributed, mostly from the first half of the 20th century. And I would say specifically, the ones I've seen have been mostly from the 1930s to 1950s, which suggests that this manuring issue, this fertilization issue, continues well into the mid 20th century. And there's you see all kinds of styles of ceramics and whatnot, different decorative motifs. I mean, far more than you'd expect to find on an average farmstead in Southern Maryland or anywhere else for that. So here's an example of, this was actually wooded at the time, but an old field, and the heavy blue lines are topography, but you see all these lines in here, red and blue. These are statistically simulated distributions of ceramics and vessel glass. And what they say, the upshot of them is that the stuff is more or less uniformly distributed throughout this whole area. All these ceramics and vessel glass, and also where the red dots are, swizzle sticks. Swizzle sticks, they started becoming a thing in 1920s, 1930s with cocktails. You don't find these on your average farmstead. You wouldn't expect to find them anyway. We didn't actually recover these. I just thought I'd provide an example for the under 60 crowd who maybe haven't seen these before. Nowadays they're all plastic. But this is the Russell farm where we found this, and we know Russell was a United States Department of Agriculture employee specializing in pig, and we have documentary evidence that tells us he was feeding Washington garbage to his pigs on this farm. Another farm near Pasadena in northern Anne Arundel County. All these are shovel test pits. Virtually all of them are filled in, red or black, indicating we got one or two sherds of whiteware or vessel glass from every one of those holes. The stuff isn't clustered. It's just uniformly spread across this field, and that tells us this is manure spreading. The piggery that I showed you pictures of earlier, it was just about a mile away from here. In Baltimore, looking at the dates we have and what they were doing, we know there's some city records from 1882, 1901. They were just barging this stuff out. A lot of it was just dumped into the Chesapeake Bay, and most of it floated back again. But they were also field spreading it. They were giving it to farmers. The farmers just either composted it and then spread it, but some farmers clearly were just spreading the trash across their fields. From 1902 to 1908, and then 1908 to 1919, under different administrations, they were reducing the garbage at that process I described earlier, where they're generating glycerin from it and tankage, which would be used to make fertilizer. And then they had their experiment 1919 to 1921 with setting up their own piggery with, I don't know how many thousands of pigs that they fed on the garbage that ended up going belly up. And then briefly, they went back to field spreading before setting up a new reduction plant also in northern Anne County. So in World War I, we have various agencies that were concerned about conserving resources, and hog feeding was one of the things they had in mind, and they came up with guidelines for cities. If you're a city of 10 to 100,000 people, this could work for you. And they actually came up with figures, $5 million worth of pork annually, 20 pounds, I assume a day, of garbage feeds one pig. 1,000 persons through their garbage feed 20 to 30 pigs. Rendering for the bigger towns, so they can, basically a factory type situation where they can produce that grease and also, create fertilizer. And then incineration, which kind of destroys everything, except you end up with ash you have to deposit. But it did produce steam for power, which was also important during the war years. If you could use garbage to create steam for heat and electricity, it means you don't have to use coal. That coal could then be used by the United States Navy and by defense industries. So we've got these different kinds of information, and there's more. This is kind of a sampling. Ray's been working on this in Anne Arundel County, in our first election district where Smithsonian Environmental Research Center is located. There are things that we are doing, that we have done to the landscape through unwise use of the land, through uses that are far more intensive, that no matter what the practices, the land cannot stand. And it's created a lot of problems. We've lost farms, and by extension, we've lost the farm families that cultivated those farms. We've lost these port towns. We found, at least temporarily, a solution to garbage production in these rapidly enlarging, growing cities. But even now, I mean, who does that? Where's the garbage go in Baltimore and Washington? It goes into landfills. The scale of the problem is such that we turning it into fertilizer and glycerin probably just aren't practical. There's no facilities big enough to handle the huge amounts of garbage we produce. There are cottage industry level where people are collecting spent oil from fast food restaurants, for instance, collecting kitchen garbage for composting and making fertilizer. But by and large, our garbage, along with the rest of the trash, goes into landfills. The creation of the Maryland Bureau of Immigration I find really fascinating. When you see the attitudes in our political system today towards immigration, I mean, the focus is on undocumented immigrants, but certainly a lot of the negative attitudes have been addressed towards immigration in general. People coming across the border without documentation, they kind of bear the brunt of it. They're the easy target. But it's pretty clear that we're not that friendly towards immigration and haven't been for a very long time. Chinese exclusion acts of the 1890s, the antipathy towards Irish Catholics coming over in the mid-19th century, the antipathy and the quotas placed on various Southern and Eastern European immigrants coming in the early 20th century. We've not been that friendly towards immigration, and yet Maryland in the 1890s into the first decade of the 20th century found it necessary to create a government agency, not a very big one, but still an agency, to go out and recruit immigrants. I find that fascinating. But all this ties into how we've used the land, or how we've abused the land, and how we've altered it. And I think where this research is going to go is we're going to find more elements of the story. Hopefully we'll integrate those elements a little better than I've done this evening. This is really a first shot. We'll be bringing in the stuff that Ray has been doing with late 19th century agriculture in Anne Arundel County, and what we can learn by using various sorts of databases to see how these folks have altered the soils. And eventually, I think, this is something for you to think about too, Ray, is we really need to talk about how, get down to brass tacks. How does the environment of Southern Maryland, how does what we see today when we drive around or walk around, how would it have looked a century ago? And how would it have looked 2 centuries ago? There is some information on 2 centuries ago. We have a lot of visitors to this area writing about the desolate condition of Southern Maryland, all these overgrown, abandoned fields. But I think ultimately we really need to be able to paint a portrait for folks as to how the land we see today is not the land that was here 100 or 200 years ago. Anyway, I think that's it for this evening. That's all I got. I'm happy to take questions.
Quick question for you, Jim.
Take your
So
time.
do you know where the water table level is in a lot of the agricultural areas?
That is a very interesting and very complex question. Because archaeologically, we can look at fluctuating water tables where we can see their manifestations today. If we're out in the woods somewhere and we dig a hole, and within the first foot or so, we come down on what we call redox soils, redoxymorphic soils. That is, soils that have sort of patches of rust colored and patches of gray, where the iron has moved through the soil. The soil has become discolored from the fluctuating water table. And it's hard to tell just when that started happening, but it's certainly clear today where certain areas, the water table is seasonally fluctuating, causing wet areas. How far back does that date? Well, we have some of those redoxymorphic soils in areas where we're also finding aboriginal sites dating back several thousand years. And clearly they weren't parked in the middle of a wetland, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Clearly something's happened. Also, we found with middle archaic sites dating back, I don't know, 6,000 to 8,000 years on that order. We found a couple of these things in the middle of what are now wetlands, except the sites themselves show up on these little rises of better drained soils, just barely above the wetland. And that suggests that there might have been open water around those sites, and that the wetland soils we see today are actually redeposited. So there, it isn't necessarily that the water table has changed so much as it may have, but sediments have filled in what used to be open water.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot that could be done with that, but it really requires a specialist to at least give us some guidance so we know. Anybody else?
I see urban areas throughout the world. What we do with the garbage is going to become much more of an issue than we see today.
We'll do the video too.
Well, the thing is, we still need fertilizer, right?
Yes.
And, where does garbage come from? Well, we're growing crops, raising livestock. So we're taking these nutrients out of the soil and we're moving them somewhere else where we consume and either throw stuff out or it passes through the alimentary canal and into our septic systems. But that waste does not go back to where the material originally came from. So it's a classic extractive model where we go out into rural areas, we extract resources, in this case, nutrients in one form or another, and we bring them into urban areas where they're consumed. And little ever gets back to the place of origin. And so there's clearly a distribution problem there. And I think it's not just a matter of solving sewage and trash problems in urban areas. The problem is we need to get these byproducts back to the place of origin so we can refertilize those fields. It amazed me when I used to work in Arizona, and I'd even camp out next to sites we were working on, out in the middle of nowhere, and there'd be cattle. There'd be people raising cattle on land. You got to wonder, why? It's this desert. Why? And the reality is that decades ago, it was still, not my idea of ideal land for farming, but that land is degraded.
Same in New Mexico. I saw the same in New Mexico.
Yep, New Mexico, Arizona, the Great Plains, all, those areas have been heavily degraded by raising cattle to ship back to Eastern markets. And so we're removing water because, the cattle don't leave New Mexico dehydrated. They're carrying water with them. They're carrying all those nutrients, and they wind up back east. And that stuff is missing in the Great Plains and Southwest. So again, it's a matter of, it's not just a matter of, stuff moving to urban areas. We're not getting the byproducts, the necessary resources back to their origins. And so, if our society is becoming more and more urban, that's because we deplete the rural areas more and more. They have less and less to offer.
I don't know how common it was, but back in the 50s and 60s, at least anyway, in my hometown in upstate New York, they had a process where they would take raw sewage, process it. I'm not sure what the process was to do it, bag it and sell it as fertilizer. They've since stopped that.
We went one step better in Maryland. I've worked a couple of fields where they take the processed but still liquefied sewage and they would spray it on agricultural fields. So we'd be walking along on fields and we'd find, those plastic sanitary napkin type things on the ground, all kinds of other stuff that went through the process and wound up on cultivated fields. And that is, at least one of them was a sod farm. I think the other one was for, corn and wheat and stuff. So, but I mean, it's processed. It's not like the waste is a biological hazard. But there's limited applicability for that because, where do you get enough sewage? Where can you treat enough sewage, collect enough of it and treat it, and then still get it to a nearby agricultural field? There's not a lot of agriculture in downtown Baltimore or Washington. There's just limits to how far you can transport the original waste and then the processed resource. So the experiments are kind of interesting for the liquid approach. Well, when you talk about New York, it seems to me it's more suited because it's easy to ship.
Doesn't there have to be a process during treatment to sanitize, to get rid of disease?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're making it biologically neutral, although it's still, of course, a medium for microorganisms, but they're local microorganisms and, presumably safe. I mean, when I was out on these fields, I could smell it. But I'm here today and not dead yet.
The National Zoo used to sell animal poop, zoo poo. I don't know if they're still doing that or not, but you could buy a bag of, composted giraffe poop or something like that.
Well, that's as much a marketing thing as it is a waste disposal problem. I'm sure they have a lot of manure to deal with. And at the same time, if they could turn it into a marketable product, it helps promote the Smithsonian Zoo. That works.
It's Joanne. Got a question for you. First of all, just a point. I read somewhere that in China, using human waste is a natural thing that it just happens all the time. There's no real cultural avoidance of it. And I want to ask you that if that's actually the case. But the other thing is, could you talk a bit about colonial times and whether or not the early farmers used waste, and did you see any evidence of that to reinvigorate the soils after they had been depleted?
Okay, sure. I mean, let me say, first of all, we're talking about there's human waste and there's household wastes. We know, for instance, in medieval and early modern Europe, people were paid to clean out privies, which often include kitchen waste as well. And it would be used, would be composted and used as fertilizer. Yeah, the Chinese have been doing this forever. Most rural areas, they would compost all kinds of waste. I remember during the energy crisis in this country, there were reports of the Chinese setting up, they have these, privies for human waste, and they'd be capped. And they would siphon off methane from those privies to cook stoves. So they'd actually use the methane coming from human waste to cook.
They do that in India from cows.
We kind of do that now too. There are, landfills where they collect volatile gases like that and burn them for energy generation. I don't know how widespread it is, but I mean, there are things that can be done. Technologies are there. It's largely a question of whether or not they're economical. In terms of the colonial period, most kitchen waste was probably just heaved out into the kitchen yard for yard fowl and pigs and other animals. I mean, there's little evidence archaeologically that a lot of the material was ever carted any further. The exception being the nastier stuff like, from shellfish and fish. We dug several privies near Bowie, Maryland, a couple of years ago. I've talked about that particular site where lots of fish bones in the bottoms of the privy. So they were throwing out, that wasn't going out into the yard. But things like, vegetable leftovers and whatnot, they were just heaved out to chickens. We have lots of reports of farmers feeding, taking all kinds of household garbage, some of them feeding it directly to pigs, many of them actually boiling it up outside, adding bran from after wheat is milled and other stuff, boiling it up and feeding that as quote unquote slop to the pigs. So there's long traditions of doing this sort of stuff in rural areas. The problem is most of them aren't feasible in an urban environment. There's just too much garbage, not to mention the sewage.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a problem of scale, and then a problem of getting the resulting product to where it could be used. I hope that sort of answers your question. Any other questions?
Well, today we have so many more synthetic materials versus in the 18th and 19th century, where most of the waste was able to break down. Today we have a new problem with synthetics.
I would say that's
challenging.
Yeah, I would say that was the case up until World War II.
Yes.
Plastics, consumer plastics, they were around from the late 19th century, but they're essentially a product of the post-war industry. Once we're no longer making armaments, you got all that production capacity. What do you do with it? Well, you produce consumer goods. Plastics really super developed during World War II. And so the capacity was there. So we're using what we see in terms of landfills as largely a product of the post-World War II effort. Prior to that, yeah, you do get trash. I mean, certainly, but nowhere near on the scale or the probably poundage per person per day.
Well, that was the thing too. I remember back when I was a kid, they would collect rags, and the rags would be used for making paper. Except today, so much has a synthetic blend to it. If it has any natural product in it at all, you can't make paper from it anymore.
Well, most of the rag picking ended in probably the 1880s as we learned how to make cheap paper from wood pulp. But prior to the 1880s, rag picking was a big thing. Collecting it was all, it was, as far as I know, it was just for paper making. What you remember is probably more of a reinventing of that tradition, or people who are interested in going back and producing linen paper, high quality paper, but certainly newspaper and everything from the 1880s, stuff used by school kids. It was all cheap wood pulp paper, very acidic. And that's why even a newspaper today, leave it lying around for a couple of days, especially in the sun, it just turns brown. It's not made to last. It's cheap stuff. And then it goes into the landfill. For some archaeologists to dig up 100 years later and come up with datable deposits, because there we find the preserved remains in newspapers with their dates on them. This is true. This happened in the 1980s with Bill Rathje and his garbage project, where they're getting cores from landfills, and going down many feet, they come up with intact newspapers with the dates on them and everything, so they can date deposits. Once it's in a landfill, unless you introduce oxygen, it's an anaerobic environment, and that stuff isn't going anywhere, even the biodegradable stuff. Any other questions or comments? Next month, I'm going to be talking about, I think, Western Maryland pottery, mostly from the 18th and early 19th centuries. And that will be it until September. We're taking a summer break. So I hope to see you all. Don't forget, the Archaeological Society of Maryland field session is out at Denton on the Eastern Shore, working on a really nifty Native American site. Beautiful location on the Choptank River. Don't miss it.